and welcome back. I hope you had a chance to have a good productive break. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ji Zun. She's a professor of psychology at California State University at Los Angeles and the director of the Learning Lab at Cal State LA. She's co-author of the interactive textbook, Introduction to Statistics, a Modeling Approach, published by coursecata.org. Her PhD in cognitive science and psychology is from Indiana University, Bloomington. She's interested in how cognitive and perceptual processes foster rich and transferable learning. Her work examines methods of applying these psychological insights at scale to issues like mathematics remediation and student success. And the central idea behind Ji's work is that learning changes the way that we see the world. I'm also a big fan of her Twitter feed, CogSciMom. I love her tweets about her kids. When I tweet about my daughter, in fact, those are the ones that get the most reading. So I encourage you to follow along with her on Twitter. Based on our last session, we have a lot of questions and we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So just please enter them in the Q&A and we will get to them in the question moderation. And for those questions that we don't have a chance to get to, I'll transfer them all over to a Twitter post at hashtag EdCog2020. And throughout the day, as Ji has time, she can get to the rest of those questions. So please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Ji Zun.
Oh, thank you so much, Joe. This is such a pleasure for me to be here, here in California with you. And I'm really glad to find EdCog because I never knew about this conference before, but it really feels like, oh my God, these are like all the people I would love to be with. So I want to just take a moment to ask you to think back across your education, right? Whatever you consider your education, right? What was one thing that was hard for you to learn, but now you see how important it was for you to learn, right? Because sometimes I think the hardness and the importance sometimes go hand in hand, but I feel like we don't shout that out enough. So, if you're on Twitter, you could put it on EdCog2020, or you could write it in the chat, and I hope to read it later. So I want to talk a little bit about our theory, practicing connections. And it's really a theory we developed because we were trying to teach hard things to all students. And we're really looking to cognitive science to help us see what we could do to teach them hard things. Not the easy stuff. You got that. They got that already, right? The hard stuff. And I want to acknowledge my wonderful collaborators who are with me in California, but not here. And without their hard work, none of this would be possible. And if you have questions at any time, please feel free to write in the chat or in the Q&A or on Twitter. So I want to tell you about an exciting email I got once from a student researcher who was working on our statistics learning project. And he said, oh my God, growth mindset at week 1 is correlated with the final exam. Look at this R. And I was like, wow, we have to meet right away. Let's submit to AERA, right? I was super excited, right? Then he came to my office, we were talking about it, we were looking at a bunch of things. He had his computer, he had his SPSS, he had his R open. It was really exciting. And then things started looking weird to us. And so I asked him to just look at a scatter plot, right? I'm like, I don't know, pull up a scatter plot. Let's see what this looks like. And here's what it looked like. So as you can imagine, what actually happened was there were a few missing data points coded as -999. And he had done some analysis where he didn't tell the whatever programming language he was using that those were missing data. So there was not actually this gigantic correlation. But we figured it out and we didn't publish it or anything. So that's good. That's a good story, right? But I want to point out something about this situation, right? I want to call this a hard situation to figure out, but real, it's authentic. I myself have done something like this before where I, reverse coded something wrong, or I had some character that was like crazy and I couldn't find it in my spreadsheet, right? We've all had this. And I want to call this transfer. And it's not transfer in the way that analogical reasoning, which is the subfield that I'm really into, right? Traditionally has thought of analogical transfer. It's not just applying a concept to a new situation. He already understood correlation enough to know, wow, this is good, this is interesting, this is important, right? It was really about coordinating all the stuff he knew for a new context, right? Coordinating regression and correlation and scatter plots, all this stuff, putting it together for a new situation to really problem solve, right? And so I want to put forth a kind of a new and richer definition of transfer. This idea that we need to not only remember and retrieve and map and do all that stuff, but also to coordinate multiple concepts for situations. And that's the basis of what we think of as transfer, right? These connections, these coordinations, right? Like, so here I have this little schematic where imagine this person on top. Oh, you can't see what I'm pointing to, but imagine the person on top who really has all the same concepts as this person on the bottom, but has fewer connections. And we would argue that, let's say they come across a situation and they really need B, but they just think of F at first, right? There's like no way to activate B if B is not immediately activated, right? But a person who has lots of connections, let's say they also immediately think of F, but F might remind them of E, which reminds them of G, which reminds them of B, and the B helps them figure out, oh, maybe I should look at a scatter plot, right? And so we're arguing that perhaps these connections are the basis of transfer. And for short, I'm going to call that understanding. Right? Whatever we think of understanding is, I mean, we think of understanding as really good and desirable, right? And we're going to argue, hey, maybe the connections, that's the basis of understanding. And it's not just us, there's lots of research around this. We have a review paper that's under review, but I want to point out a study by Lochner, Gurlitt, and Nuckols? I'm not sure. But they looked at medical experts versus intermediate medical students, I think. And what they saw was not only were there more connections in the experts, but also fewer concepts, which is interesting, right? We don't think of experts as having less, but they have more connections and fewer concepts, right? That's what expertise might be like. So I want to reframe that question. How do we help students learn hard things? I want to reframe it as, how do we help students get this interconnected understanding, right? And we look to cognitive science. But as we did, we just saw this huge research to practice gap. There's so many interesting studies, many of them done by the people on this call. And I want to give you just some examples just from our lab studies. And when I talk about lab, it's like lab and classroom, but often they're just like 1 hour because we got the professor to specially let us do something, or we got them to send out an extra credit homework, right? And these are some of the findings that we think are really relevant to right now, this time of coronavirus and everyone going remote, right? So for one, we find that video version of some topic, for example, sum of squares in statistics, is more effective than text. And it seems to be primarily because students don't really read the text, it seems. They go through the text really fast, right? So they just spend more time on the video because they spend the actual time of the video, right? It turns out interleave questions seem to be better than blocked questions during either a video or text. It seems that providing both the video and text seems to be better than one or the other. Video with gestures is better than video without gestures. And the congruent gestures seem to be better than incongruent gestures with the content of what's being spoken. So, great, fine. These don't seem too controversial, but What I would say is, even for these studies run by my students and my collaborators, the problem with a lot of these studies is that they're really focused on learning one of these concepts. I mean, sum of squares, yeah, it's important. I don't know, it's good, it's something you should learn, right? But it's one thing, it's not an understanding of statistics and data, right? And there's less that cognitive science has to say about promoting this. You know, there are studies that we could look at, things like, you know, studies of experts and other cool longitudinal studies, but those also don't do experiments either, right? And so it's hard to know, well, why did these experts become experts, right? And so I want to point out that generally that there are several obstacles between research and practice. And I say this as somebody who does the research, but also goes into the classroom and feels like, oh, shouldn't I know something about this, right? As researchers, we produce stuff, we produce these great ideas, right? And we publish them with such hard work and papers, and reviewer two hates us, but you know, we go through that, right? But guess who's not reading those papers? A lot of people who are designing course materials. Textbook publishers aren't reading those papers, right? And so people are designing course materials during the time of coronavirus and COVID-19. People were just like putting up course materials. They were not stopping to read a paper on how to design those materials. They're just like, I gotta get that up there right now, right? And then instructors will inevitably get those course materials from somewhere and then figure out that it doesn't work for their students. We've all had that moment where like, oh, this did not go as planned, right? And they figure out a workaround. They duct tape their way to get this thing to work better, to work as they wanted to, right? And they figure out some solutions, but you know what? Those ideas never get back to the designers and they never get back to the researchers. So even a great idea is really, I don't know, at best 20%. Right? And the rest of it is implementation. And that's the part that's really hard, right? So our vision is a new way of doing research and development, one where we could each do our part and do it well, and there's not as much wasted effort. And so our vision is to create research and development communities around online learning resources so that the research is in the materials. You don't have to read the separate paper. It's already inside the materials, right? And the instructors, when they have an idea about, oh, how to make these particular materials work better, the researchers can get that idea and run off and do some research on it, right? And designers and developers, they could be developing things that will be immediately useful. So that's the context that we want to think of, the research context that we're in. But we need to learn by doing, because it sounds all great and all, but you know, the devil's in the details, right? And so the Introduction to Statistics, a Modeling Approach book that Joe talked about, that's really an effort to just try to do this and learn from it and learn from that process. Now, today's talk that I'm going to focus on is, well, so how do you create this first set of, you know, what we call the minimal viable product, right? It's the minimum, bare minimum, right? But how do we create materials according to what we know from cognitive science that could lead students to understand hard things? And statistics is hard, right? It's what we call our theory, practicing connections. Okay, and so the rest of today, I'm going to talk about that. If you want to check out the textbook, it's free for anyone to use, any instructors or students, and you could check out a free version of it on Canvas. And if you're interested, you could let me know, and we're having a series of workshops in the next 2 weeks for people who want to teach it in the fall. But our textbook, we call it a textbook, but you know, we try to really incorporate all these studies that we've done, right? And all these studies that other people have done. We really try to stand on the shoulders of giants. The pages interleave narrative, video, our exercises, questions, we give feedback. There's all kinds of stuff in there, right? So even though we call it a textbook, it's super interactive. Now, A lot of you are cool researchers out there, right? What are some research ideas that you might have that would be interesting to test in the context of real stats courses to help students understand better, right? Wouldn't it be cool to test your theory in a real stats course, right? So please tweet and let's get started talking about ideas. Okay, so back to our theory. So how do we help students learn hard things? I'm going to summarize the whole thing for you in 3 words, so you could feel free to log off after this, right? Practice making connections. We're very simple people. If connections are what you want, we're like, okay, then practice making those, right? Easy to tweet, hard to do. And here's why. Here's why this learning by doing is so important. Because every theory inevitably crashes into reality, right? These are literally the concepts that I'm supposed to cover in my intro stats class that I teach in my psychology department, right? Oh my gosh, which thing should I connect? If I try to connect all of them to each other, that's an infinite number of hours that I'm gonna have to have my students spend time in my class. And apparently that's inhumane, right? So how am I supposed to do this, right? Also, did you know we're in a global pandemic? Because I don't have time for like all these other things because I have to teach my elementary school children like how to read. So ain't nobody got time for that. So we need to figure out what are the connections, right? How do we practice making them? And then how do you do research on this, by the way? Because you can't do it in like a 1-hour lab setting, right? And so all my examples are gonna come from introductory statistics, but I'd be really interested to dialogue with you about whatever class you study and what are the connections and how do you practice making those connections? All right, so I want you to think about the connections as kind of like the ingredients, and then the practicing of the making of the connections will be like the cooking demo, right? So here I'm just gonna lay out the ingredients, and this part is gonna go relatively quickly, okay? But don't worry, we'll come back to the ingredients when we cook. So connections, they have to be powerful, generalizable, and accessible to novices. A lot of times, experts have these connections where a novice is like, what? Like, that does not help me, right? And so we think there are 3 kinds of connections that are really important to figure out in a domain. 1, what's the world of your domain? What are the core concepts in your 10-week course? What are the representations you're going to use to embody those concepts? So in statistics, we think there's 2 things that are part of the world of statistics, right? And in the world, we think authentic practices, like really actually doing statistics in the world, that matters a lot in a statistics course. Also, the different contexts matter. So the first thing is authentic practices. Whenever any of us do statistics, we're really interested in a question because we see variation, right? Like if everyone did the same in the class, there wouldn't be any variation to explain. But the fact that some people do well and some people don't do well, some people mind wander, some people don't, some people die from coronavirus, some people don't, right? We're interested in that variation. We want to explore that variation, and that's an authentic practice. We also want to model that variation. We want to say, oh, I think this might be what's generating this variation. And we want to make models of that and then evaluate those models. And those 3 practices are really authentic to data science. But practices are not the whole story. The other part of the world is various contexts. And so this is, I think, the best part of research, right? Cognitive science research tells us a lot about how students interact in different story contexts, right? And so I think we know a lot about that. And the question is, well, so what contexts should we present? And one of the things that we've thought about a lot is take the example of an observation, a unit of observation. Typically in a psychology class, the unit of observation is a person. And so often students are like, why are you even defining this? This is like so pointless, And so we actually go and make sure that they struggle with other contexts that are not people, things like states, tables, families, couples, right? And we try to come back to these different contexts because we know that their misconceptions will be that, oh, the observation is probably a person. Now, what are the core concepts of a domain? Oftentimes, I really wish we could just ask an expert, but it turns out that experts say some things that are not really helpful to novices because they can't imagine how hard statistics looks to a novice, right? But we think there are 3 core concepts. One is the distribution triad, that there are different distributions in statistics and we need to keep them separate. Another one is an expert level core concept. Often experts will say, oh, all of statistics is data equals model plus error. But many students don't understand that at all. Like, I think my students would try to like subtract error from both sides and try to solve for model or something, right? So, it's not gonna be really helpful at first, but it could help us organize the domain. And the third thing is something that's hard for humans in general, not just for statistics students. It's the idea that randomness is a data generating process, that randomness could cause variation. And as humans, we're good at causal reasoning. We're not so good at reasoning about randomness. Now, concepts are just concepts. They're like these highfalutin things. How are they embodied? We picked a few representations because they are highly alignable. Our one thing that we're trying to do is practice making connections. So we're like, whatever the representations are, they have to foster connections. So we used a bunch of different representations for their connectability. The first is word equations, things like data equals model plus error. We get students to write a lot of these, things like, oh, tips at a restaurant, that's probably equal to, some variation in the quality of service plus some other stuff, right? Or maybe tips equals attractiveness plus other stuff. We also get them to write GLM notation, the general linear model. It's a hard notation, but it's highly alignable, and that's why we picked it. We also picked R because R is an authentic practice, but it's also a group, the Mosaic group, Randall Pruitt and colleagues. They've done such an amazing job just really thinking about how to get R code to be more alignable to linear model notation. And also data visualization. So many times I feel like, oh man, if an RA came in not knowing anything about a t-test, but could make fancy graphics, I would take that RA in a heartbeat. Okay, so those are the ingredients. How do you practice making these connections now, right? And so this is the cooking demo. And when we're talking about practicing connections, we're really talking about an instructional framework, right? How do you give students the opportunity to make the connections themselves? And we think there are kind of different dimensions, right, of a teaching moment or a learning opportunity, right? So the first is there needs to be a focus on explicit connections. And often experts, they are all about the explicit connections. And so when you hear a well-formed lecture, it's high on explicit connections. But at the same time, it's very low on this other dimension we think is important, productive struggle, because there's the whole making of the connections. The students have to make the connections. The issue with the well-formed lecture is that the instructor makes all the connections and hands them to the student, right? But on the other end of the extreme is something like discovery learning, where it's super high in productive struggle, but there's no guarantee that the connections are going to be the focus at all, right? And obviously, there's also being low on both of these dimensions, things like step-by-step procedures, right? Low on the explicit connections, not about the connections, but also really easy, not really struggling at all. And we want to be in this sweet spot high on explicit connections and high on productive struggle. And I feel like so many of the talks and the presentations here in this conference are really in that sweet spot. They're trying to get students to take better notes and, like actively engage even in a lecture and, doing all these cool things. And I think that's a really important quadrant. But we want to add the component of practice, the practice making connections, because hard things are not learnable in an hour. They take weeks, months, years, right? And it's that element of time. And so we want to add in Anders Ericsson's concept of deliberate practice, who passed away recently, there's this idea that you don't just want to practice making the same easy connections till it becomes fluent, but that you want to adjust the situation over time so that you continue to have a high level of struggle, even though you're practicing the same things, right? That's a cool idea. And we think that's really important to practice making connections. So I want to show you how all this comes together in our book. Let me give you an example. In statistics, we talk about variation, and tips is one area where we see a lot of variation. Sometimes people tip a lot, sometimes people tip very little, everything in between, right? And there's this idea that's common in servers that maybe if you do something a little special, like personalize, or maybe if you draw a smiley face on the receipt, you might get a better tip, be seen as a little more cheery. So Rind and Bordia in 1996 did this study where they randomly assigned tables to either get a smiley face on their check or, the check, as usual. Now, in a traditional approach, what we call the bits approach, where we teach all these little bits, you might spend a day on teaching people the t-test and, calculating t, and, p-value is 0.08, and students always ask, is this supposed to be bigger than 0.05 or smaller than 0.05, right? And then you have to talk about rejecting the null and all this stuff, right? And then that's it. That's the end. But here's how we take this situation. First, we want them to explore the variation. This is what a real data scientist would do. And for the first 4 chapters of our book, there are no calculations. I mean, there's our code, but no calculations. It's just all visualizations. And it's really to prevent what we call premature calculations, right? And so what we have them do is make these things, but also practice making connections. For example, we might have students look at data tables, like just, big rows and columns of data, and to map those on to visualizations of data. For example, we might say, find table 1 in this histogram. And we really practice making these connections across multiple representations. Not only that, but we have students represent ideas, hypotheses as models. But we just get them to write these word equations, such as tips equals the condition the table is in, plus other stuff. And using R, it's aligned so that you could see, tips tilde condition is sort of like tips equals condition, right? And we're trying to get them to already think about, is the data generating process maybe having to do with condition? Does condition somehow make bigger tips or make smaller tips? And so we're constantly getting students to think about that, even as they're just looking at visualizations of sample data. But we also want them to connect to the other core concept of randomness. And that's the hard one. And what we get them to do is try to think, is it possible that condition has nothing to do with it? Could it be just randomness, all that other stuff? And it's really hard to conceptualize that until you do it. And so we get students to actually make different groups based on randomness. We use this shuffle function from that mosaic group where the data points are just shuffled across the 2 conditions. And not only that, but students visualize that shuffled data. And what we get them to do is practice saying, does my empirical data look like these shuffled data, or does it look kind of different? And it's all just eyeballing this stuff. We're not calculating anything. But we get them to see, some of these shuffled data could look kind of like my real data. Maybe my real data could have been the outcome of shuffling or some other random process. So that's where we get up to. And students start to feel like, I wish there was a way we could judge this other than just being like, I don't know, it kind of looks like it could be random. I wish there was a way I could put a number on it. Really? Oh, well, let's go into the next chapter and create some formal models then. And so from that, we create these formal models using the GLM notation, using LM function in R. And we get students to actually fit data, interpret these model fits, right? But we want them to make the connections. We don't want us to make the connections. We want them to make the connections. And so they might get situations like this where they see the best fitting model fits are 27 and 6 in this GLM notation. But it's like, what does that mean, right? And students pretty quickly are able to map, I think 27 is the mean of the control group. That's the mean number of US dollars that the tables were tipped in the control condition. So then what's the 6? And at first, everyone thinks, that must be the mean of the smiley face group. But because they have the visualization that they're trying to map to, they're like, wait, that can't be it, because it's higher up. The mean is higher up. And with struggle, they eventually figure out, that is the little increment or mean difference between these two groups. And that's how we get them to start to make the connections so that the GLM notation is actually meaningful to them. And then we could go back to all those shuffling data sets that we looked at before, where they could actually fit the models to these shuffled data. And they could look and see, the increment, the mean difference, the B1 was 6 in my real data. But a lot of the shuffled data, they're not as big as 6. Some are negative, some are positive. They're kind of clustered around 0. I wonder, right? And so you could see already, we're setting them up for sampling distributions, right? And that's where we get to evaluating models, where now we're able to make a leap from that to say, what if we just did this thousands of times? That'd be a lot of jitter plots to look at, right? What if we just pulled out all these B sub 1s, right? And looked at those in a histogram? And that's where we get to things like the central limit theorem, right? So from doing this whole thing from the beginning, having a conceptual structure from the beginning and constantly mapping to it, making it harder and harder in each subsequent round by introducing more and more formal concepts, our students are able to kind of build up a connected understanding of statistics, or that's what we think. And so that brings us to the question, well, so how do you do research on this stuff, huh? That sounds like a very nice plan, but do you have any evidence, huh? Yeah, this is really hard to do research on because you can't just ask people to learn all this stuff in a 1-hour lab study or even hop into a regular stats class and be like, hey, can I present this in 1 day, right? Can't do it, right? And so that's where our model of the Better Book model comes into play. We partner with instructors who are using the textbook because they're interested in having a free interactive textbook. And we're able to partner with researchers, many students, postdocs, professors. We're able to partner with designers and able to do studies on these course materials in the context of real statistics classes. And we're doing it at 3 different universities, right? 3 different levels of California's higher education institutions right now, but we're adding more. All right, so one of the things we could do in our better book model is that because all this stuff is in a book, it's in a textbook, we could actually examine learning that can only happen over a long period of time. For example, this idea of data equals model plus error, that's really pretty useless if you learn it in a 1-hour lab setting. I'm pretty sure that has like almost zero effect, right? It's like, okay, wash over me, right? But because our students have repeated practice coordinating all their concepts with data equals model plus error, even from visualizations, they're coordinating those concepts together. What we see is that when they go from looking at group-based models, like a 2-group model, to a regression model, we see enhanced learning and heightened similarity for them. They feel like, oh, this feels very similar to what we've done before. There are a couple of little different things. And that's really different from the experience that we often see in introductory statistics, where students see no connection between t-tests and regression. They're like, oh, those are like different. They're all taught in a stats class. That's the only similarity, right? And what we see that we're really excited about is students adapt their understanding of B1. They used to think of it as like an increment between 2 groups. They start to think of it as, oh, it's like an increment between these little things down here. You could think of it as, oh, going up 1 by 1, and this is the increment. And we have a new paper that's under review, but we think it's pretty close, in Journal of Statistics Education, where even without direct instruction, they're able to think through multiple regression. This was in a UCLA sample where we asked students to think about, why do you think there's so many sums of squares? Well, what do you think about this? What do you think this is? What do you think that is, right? And what do you think the interpretation of this B sub 2 and this B sub 1 is? What do you think that is? And students were able to modify their thinking somewhat to be able to anticipate multiple regression. Like some of their details were off, but they're things where it's like, oh, it feels like what you've learned from regression is useful for me in order to teach you multiple regression. Another thing we could do by examining students in the context of a statistics textbook is that we could actually look at a diverse range of students and their particular contexts. And I'm just going to give you a sample of this kind of data. One thing that we've seen a lot of interest in and a lot of controversy, we didn't think it was so controversial, but it is this idea of R programming in statistics. We get beef from math, we get beef from psychology, we get beef from all over. They're like, wow, what? How can you teach people R? That's great. That's terrible, right? And then some people are like, we think that's wonderful. And we're like, oh, thank you. But students at first have pretty mixed feelings about R programming. Most of the students who are in our courses that use these textbook materials are not STEM majors. They did not want to program, they never wanted to program, and so they feel pretty mixed. But after the class, they start to feel pretty good about the R programming part of the class. But we could see there's a lot of variation across schools. At the UCLA and Cal State LA sample, we see more of a shift. And at the community college sample, although we still see a shift, we see a less pronounced shift. But as we add more schools and we add different kinds of students, we're really interested in how differences across instructors, differences across pedagogy, differences in the instructors' values and the students' values might help us predict these things. Also, we see that there's a stronger correlation between online engagement and final grade for students that work. It turns out that, there's a variation. Some students work, some students don't, some students work a little bit, right? And it turns out that for students who work either part-time or some of our students are full-time, their online engagement, their total page views in Canvas, our learning management system, is correlated with their final exam score. But for students who don't work, that doesn't seem to be an issue. Now, this was in a fully in-person class, and so we happen to have poll everywhere data for the UCLA students. And what we see is in this sample, the students who work also come to class less. And so one hypothesis is that, oh, perhaps online materials matter for students who are more constrained in their time. And that's a really big and important issue to us right now, as all of us are at home and doing 10,000 other things. But one of the things we're really excited about that we're at the very, very first stages of is using A/B testing to improve the materials over time. One of the things that we'd love to do, but we never had a chance to do it before, is doing really huge studies that take a long time to do in a randomized control experiment. And now we can, because we could put them into the textbook. And so this is a small example of that kind of work. And we think of all these A/B testing scenarios as improvement projects. We're trying to help improve the materials, right? And so one of the things we did was we had planned a series of videos where we use this distribution triad representational system to kind of reorganize what students may have read on a page. So no new information, but just reorganizing it. And half our students got these extra videos and half our students did not. And let me show you just a little bit of data from that. This is their percent correct. No, this is their number of questions correct in chapter 9, which is about sampling distributions, which tends to be a very hard concept for statistics students in general and a hard chapter. There is an effect of our experimental conditions such that the practicing connections video group does better than the control group, right? But as you can imagine, it is driven primarily by students who presumably watch the videos. I say presumably watch because we have data that they click on the video, but I do not know where their eyeballs are, right? They might be mind wandering, who knows, right? But it does turn out that watching more of the videos is correlated with percent correct. Now, here's the thing. It's messy in the real world, right? Because I told you about some data that we had in the lab where we saw that videos do better than text and all that stuff. And we thought, oh, that's so great. But it turns out that the students don't watch the videos in the first place. So they can't even mind wander, you know? Oh my gosh. And we also wondered, are these watchers just better students to begin with? And so we looked at a quiz. This was quiz 2 that happened to be given right before the videos began. And they weren't necessarily better students, but this might be a ceiling effect. So we're not sure, but that's always a possibility. But here's the thing, in our messy world, what we're really interested in is all this unexplained variation. You know, before when I just did lab studies, I still do lab studies, by the way, but when I just did lab studies, often I'm pretty happy with a group difference and, you know, you publish that and you go on your merry way, but I don't keep working on the rest of the variation, right? But in the better book model, what we're trying to get interested in is all the rest of it, because that unexplained variation matters immensely in education. We really care about all of our students learning, not just, oh, getting our effect. And so what we want to propose is that, hey, we're only making tiny, tiny improvements. All our studies, all our innovations are very tiny. But thousands of students each year take introductory statistics. And that makes me happy, not just as somebody who cares about a data-based understanding of life, but as somebody who really cares about doing research to help students learn hard things. We could use their data to continuously improve freely available resources so that we could eventually be able to teach all students hard things. So thank you so much for taking your time out to come to this.
Thanks so much, G. That was amazing. Really, really enjoyed your talk. And just to pass on a comment from a student, Anne said that as a current psychology undergrad, I'm in awe of how amazing this learning model is. After 3 stats courses in university, I still find myself unable to make connections between statistics concepts. So is that a typical observation?
Yes, yes. You know, we've we have all these studies where I'm so good at showing how students can't learn stats. Like that's like my bread and butter. And we do these studies where we follow students after their statistics class and ask them things like, hey, this study showed that this group did 10 points better than this group. Is there a significant effect? And students are like, yes, no further information necessary. And so was it On's comment?
Yeah. Yeah.
On is not alone in this. This is a research-based finding that it is really hard to make these connections. Even something as basic as, hey, maybe look at the rest of your distribution to think about whether a group difference is meaningful, right? Even that's really hard. And we tested students like 3 weeks after their statistics class in their research methods class. And it's like, all the knowledge was gone, right? And so that's the stuff we're really interested in.
So I think in typical stats textbooks, one thing that what we might be critical about is that you learn about the t-test, and then all of the questions are about the t-test. And then in a subsequent chapter, you might learn about ANOVA, and then all of the practice questions are about ANOVA. So what are your thoughts on interleaving of different types of test questions? Sounds like the right word to
That's right. We are all about that, because that's the thing. You do t-test, 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 ANOVA, 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 regression, regression, regression. But in real life, your question is, what should we do with this data? Right? And so what we want to do is frame it around that question from the beginning, right? That's the real question. So that's the question we should struggle with every single week. And so even with t-tests, you could do interleaving, even if that's all that students know, because you could always ask, is a t-test appropriate for this situation, right? And students are rarely asked that.
Well, I also found it really interesting how, I think you said the first few chapters, you avoid the pre-calculation syndrome. Because I think that's so true. Students, as soon as they see a formula, wow, that's something familiar. That's something I could memorize. That's something I could plug in. I don't really have to think, and I just calculate the right answer. So maybe just talk about how do you get students to buy into that, because they probably think, well, I'm not even doing stats yet.
A lot of our math instructors think that. They're like, this isn't really a stats book, huh? Yeah, and students sometimes feel that. But I think one thing that's different about our book is that because they use R, students will actually say, oh, I'm doing so much math. And I'm like, wait, when are you doing math? Because they interpret the doing of the R as doing math. And so sometimes I think, it's the equations you talk about, exactly what you've talked about, I have experienced in my classes. It's that quadrant where it's step by step. And I almost feel like we should collaborate with Jeff on this, because I feel like in a statistics class, it's like, the attention comes back when there's an equation on the board. It's like, gotta write that down. Because they feel like that's what statistics is. Mm-hmm. So that's what I should be paying attention to.
So that's like real statistics in the minds of people, in students.
Right.
Whereas, grasping the conceptual and the connections and knowing what tests to apply in an actual real world data situation is what being a statistician is.
Right. Yeah. Making a visualization and trying to figure out, should I group it this way or should I group it that way, right? Should I group it on this condition first and then this condition? Or should I put this on the y-axis? Like, those are really important considerations that we all make, but how many of us can remember the equation for pooled standard deviation? Not me. And I wrote a statistics textbook, right? I Googled that stuff.
So Ed's on Twitter, Ed Scientist, aka Veronica Yan, has been tweeting a lot of some of the key points that you've been mentioning today. And one of the things I love is that she put up that figure of that practice making connections, that 2x2 table, and how we should be really moving towards that bottom right quadrant. And so you mentioned deliberate practice. I was wondering if you could just expand on that and contrast that with another kind of popular concept of 10,000 hours to become an expert? And maybe just tell us what is the difference between these two ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think of just the 10,000 hours, I think is ambiguous, right? You don't know what kind of hours, right? They could be high quality hours, they could be really crappy hours, right? Now, one of the things about deliberate practice is that you're intentionally making it harder the next time around so that you can feel that difficulty. And I think in statistics, it's quite easy to do because even swapping out the context makes students feel like, wow, this is hard. Like, I don't know what the outcome of interest is in this scenario, right? And so even those kind of things are difficult. Even things like, should we ignore outliers in this data set versus in this other data set? We all as researchers know that you can't learn that by reading a textbook. You can't learn when to exclude outliers. You actually have to have a lot of experience with lots of different data sets that are differently shaped and differently affected by the explanatory variable in order to make that call. And so that's the kind of practice we want to give students. Let me give you a small example. A lot of times our students are more comfortable with kind of normally distributed distributions. And so on purpose, we give them studies that result in bimodal distributions, highly skewed distributions, because that variation is important for understanding statistics. And it's really important for them to work out, hey, is this model still going to work the same way, even though this is a bimodal distribution, right? And those things make it hard. And that's the deliberate practice angle.
Okay, thank you. So Veronica has another question here. First of all, she says, I wish I would have learned stats this way. It would have been much faster. So she has a question about implications of your talk for other disciplines. This sounds great for stats, but how about other disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on this for like many years. I'm very old, actually. You know, I'm haggard. But it took us just a lot of failure to come up with this. Like, I am the queen of what not to do in statistics education because I have done so many crappy things. And I think part of it is a struggle for anyone who's looking at a domain to figure out what are the core concepts that students should start practicing, right? And so we think, start with a hypothesis. Start with a hypothesis of, like, I don't know, 3 to 5 things that you think and restrict yourself on purpose and see if those really do connect to everything. And I think in the practice of doing that, you learn a lot about, oh, this is really helpful, or this concept, I don't know, it just never really came up again, even though I thought it was really important.
So, okay, along those lines, so Amanda has a comment about how important is it to have experiential learning and the real world examples. Like, I like the idea of like the tippet, like whether or not putting a happy face. I mean, that's an actual interesting real world situation. So how important is it to integrate this type of problem solving?
You know, that's something that we all think is important. Like, many of us think being authentic and like getting students to be excited and getting students authentically interested is important. And so I think that's something that we've intuitively done, but at the same time, there's a trade-off, right? Like, for example, we look at Trump voting data, we look at COVID-19 data, right? But a lot of those data sets, they have a lot of measurement error. And so a lot of the things we're interested in is, if you want students to learn about measurement error, for example, in the case of COVID-19, should we present it in COVID-19 or in a case where it's more clear, where we could clearly see, oh, there is measurement error here, right? And so part of it is, I think, a trade-off between an example that you pick because it's transparent and kind of obvious, and examples that you pick for its authenticity.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question from Carmen that was asking about for teaching math and stats. If you're making videos, do you have any comments on optimal video length?
Oh, no, we don't. We thought that video length would be correlated with watching, and at least in our videos, they are not. We have, because we have just a variety of videos. We have shorter videos, we have longer videos, but we find that it's not really correlated. But we think that most of it is driven by the fact that most students, like more than half the students, are not clicking on the video in the first place. So it doesn't matter how long the video is if they don't actually choose to watch it. So we think there's a whole lot to be done, even around just the watching of the video. We don't know what to say about the length. One thing that we are also really interested, that I think is a related issue, is the length of a page. Because, you know, on the internet, you could have as many pages as you want. You could have shorter pages, longer pages. And one of the things about Twitter or Facebook is this infinite scroll, this idea that you'll stay on longer if it's longer. And one of the things that we see in our videos is that we have a real bimodal distribution. If you click on the video, you're probably going to watch it all the way through. And if you don't click on the video, you're probably not going to watch other videos, right? And so it almost seems like if you just get them to click on it, they're probably going to watch most of it.
Okay. And so you were talking about how, you know, as researchers, you know, we're working hard to get our research out into journals, but the frontline educator is not reading them. So what's the solution here? How do we make this connection so that we can actually implement change so people can start teaching stats differently?
You know, I didn't know there was this whole field, but there's like a whole field on how teachers, primarily in K-12, how little they understand of research. There's like a whole like set of journals and stuff about that. And I think that's really true. I work with community college instructors, many of whom are adjuncts, many of whom are like teaching 6 sections and they get handed a syllabus at the last minute. Like they are definitely not thinking about what the research says. And so I think part of it is designing research-based tools for people who have no time, who have no bandwidth, right? I think designing for a person who's strapped for time, strapped for resources is a really important thing that researchers have to engage with designers to do, right? Because, you know, we don't do it all, but I think that's a really great partnership. You know, all that stuff about design-based thinking, I think is super interesting.
So I guess to kind of use sort of a medical analogy, we've got the bench science, we've got the clinical trials, and at the end of the day, we hope to have some sort of prescriptions that we could give to the frontline educator.
That's a great analogy. I love that, because I could even think of, you know, they had this issue where women who had these difficult pregnancies were like bleeding so much that their lives would be at stake. And it was actually a problem that they solved by just bundling together all the stuff they need and having that ready for every delivery, right? And so part of it might be packaging up what we already know so that somebody could quickly run by and pick it up as they go, right?
All right. And well, along those lines too, just a comment from Sharona. She's already asking about EdCog 2021 and whether or not you might be able to offer a workshop where, you know, people can extend this to other fields beyond stats and learn about how to make connections in our own fields.
Oh, I would love to. That's like my dream come true.
This is being recorded, by the way, so we've got you on record for
yeah, you'd be like, see, you could hold me to it. Yeah, I'm really excited about that idea, because we have a lot of ideas. I work with chemistry professors, I work with biology professors, I work with historians, I work with high school algebra teachers, and we're really interested in extending this beyond statistics and seeing if what we work is generalizable, because I don't think we'll know until we do.
All right. Thank you so much, G, for just like another great talk. So many ideas have emerged from this.